The biting morning wind of Chicago swept across the concrete plazas, carrying with it the cold indifference of a city rushing to work. Abigail Vance stepped off the crowded public transit bus, her worn uniform pulling tightly against her shoulders as she automatically lowered her head against the chill. For 5 long years, she had walked these exact 3 blocks toward the shimmering glass monolith known across the state as the Meridian Tower, blending perfectly into the background of rushing executives and expensive perfumes. To the thousands of souls who occupied the high-rise daily, she was merely an anonymous shadow, a silent fixture who wiped away their coffee stains and polished their mirrors before the sun fully rose. Yet, high above in his transparent palace of chrome and mahogany, a lonely billionaire had spent months watching her quiet routines from afar, completely unaware that the truth behind her existence would soon tear his entire world apart. The sudden, piercing scream shattered the pristine stillness of the grand marble lobby, like a heavy stone crashing through a sheet of delicate ice. "Stop her immediately. That woman is carrying property that absolutely does not belong to this company." Rebecca Avery stood at the top of the sweeping grand staircase, her expensive designer suit immaculate, her face flushed with a mixture of calculated triumph and theatrical outrage. Abigail froze instantly, her worn canvas bag pressed tightly against her chest, her knuckles turning completely white under the intense strain of her grip. She did not turn around right away. Instead, she closed her eyes for one long, agonizing second, breathing in the sterile, air-conditioned atmosphere, before slowly facing her accuser. Behind Rebecca, like a dark, silent tide rising in unison, dozens of corporate employees began pouring out of the elevators and offices, drawn to the public spectacle like moths to a flame. "Ms. Vance," Rebecca said, as she descended the marble steps one by one, intentionally elongating each syllable to maximize the collective humiliation of the moment. "Open that bag right now, in front of everyone, or I will have security escort you out in handcuffs for corporate theft." Abigail remained perfectly motionless, her heart drumming so loudly against her ribs that she genuinely feared the surrounding crowd could hear its frantic, terrified rhythm. Inside that simple canvas bag lay the quiet remnants of her private struggle, things she had guarded with her life against an uncaring world. She knew with absolute certainty that opening it meant exposing her deepest vulnerabilities to a crowd of wealthy strangers who had never once been forced to choose between starvation and dignity. Her silence only seemed to fuel Rebecca's aggressive stance, as the executive planted her feet a mere 2 feet away, her arms tightly crossed over her chest. "Are you suddenly deaf, old woman? I am giving you a single opportunity to clear your name before the police arrive." Rebecca sneered, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Our security cameras in the supply depot clearly caught you concealing company property this morning, so you can cooperate now, or we can let the authorities handle it." A low, judgmental murmur rippled through the gathering crowd of onlookers as several young accountants discreetly pulled out their mobile phones to record the unfolding drama. Abigail felt every single pair of eyes piercing her skin like freezing needles, recognizing the very faces she had greeted with a warm, maternal smile for half a decade. It was in that incredibly tense pocket of silence that the soft, musical chime of the executive elevator echoed through the eastern wing of the grand lobby. The heavy silver doors parted seamlessly, and Maxwell Avery, the billionaire chief executive officer and sole owner of the massive conglomerate, stepped out onto the polished floor. He stopped immediately at the edge of the crowd, his commanding presence alone causing the whispers to vanish instantly, like a candle flame blown out by a sudden draft. He was a man deeply accustomed to the world falling silent whenever he entered a room, his sharp eyes surveying the chaotic scene before him. His sister stood pointing an accusing finger, the employees crowded around in a circle, and at the center of it all was the quiet cleaning woman he had observed from his high tower without ever truly seeing her. "What is the meaning of this disruption in my lobby?" Maxwell inquired, his voice low, controlled, and carrying a distinct gravity that frightened the employees far more than any loud shouting ever could. "We are catching a thief red-handed, brother," Rebecca proclaimed proudly, tossing her styled hair over her shoulder as she gestured toward the trembling woman. "Our quarterly inventory reports have been failing to balance for months, and today the security feeds finally identified the primary culprit, hiding among our maintenance staff." Maxwell walked down the remaining steps slowly, each step echoing clearly against the pristine stone floor, until he stood directly in front of Abigail. He looked down at her from his great height, with the cold, detached distance of a ruler who did not understand the struggles of the working class. "Is what my sister's saying true?" Maxwell asked quietly, his eyes searching the worn, lined face of the woman who held his empire's cleanliness in her hands. Abigail slowly raised her eyes, and for the very first time in 5 long years, her gaze locked directly with the man who signed her meager paycheck every single month. There was no fear in her expression, nor was there the trembling guilt of a captured criminal. Instead, there was only the profound, crushing exhaustion of a soul that had endured too much for too long. "I have never stolen a single penny or a single object from anyone in my entire life, sir," she whispered, her voice carrying a heartbreaking weight. "Then, open the bag and prove it," Rebecca interjected loudly, stepping closer to ensure the crowd didn't lose their entertainment. "If your conscience is truly clear, showing us the contents of your personal belongings should cost you nothing but a moment of your time." The entire lobby seemed to hold its collective breath as a young man from the accounting department muttered a cruel encouragement for her to open it. Abigail looked at the bag pressed against her heart, then at Maxwell's unreadable face, and realized there was absolutely no escape from this engineered humiliation. With her fingers trembling from suppressed anger rather than fear, she walked to the marble reception desk and placed her bag down as if it contained something sacred. "Go ahead," Abigail said, unzipping the bag. "Look at the grand bounty I am accused of stealing." Rebecca plunged her hand in and pulled out cheap cough syrup, mended work gloves, and a stale half-loaf of bread. Then a small object fell, a worn child's shoe with sole detached, held by twine. The lobby fell silent. Abigail picked up the shoe reverently. "There is your grand corporate thief. This is what I take home after 12 hours a day. You may laugh now." No one laughed. Shame washed over the crowd. Maxwell stared at the tiny shoe in Abigail's hand, and something deeply buried within his chest, a memory he had spent decades trying to suppress, stirred violently without his permission. The image of this proud woman holding a broken child's shoe struck a chord so profound that he found himself momentarily unable to speak. "There must be a mistake on the security feeds," Rebecca stammered, taking a clumsy step backward while trying to maintain her composure. The department cameras clearly showed her concealing an item from the main supply warehouse just before 6 o'clock this morning. "I took a single bottle of cough syrup," Abigail stated firmly, standing tall as she placed the tiny shoe back into her canvas bag. "A bottle that was already marked for disposal, because its expiration date was only 3 days away. I asked the night shift supervisor, a kind man named Arthur, and he told me to take it, because it was going directly into the trash compactor anyway." She zipped her bag with a definitive snap and threw it over her shoulder. "If saving a discarded bottle of medicine to soothe a sick child makes me a criminal in the eyes of the law, then call the police. But before you do, I want every single one of you to look me in the eye." As Abigail gathered her things from the reception desk, Maxwell's eyes caught a glimpse of something else slipping from the side pocket of the bag. It was a laminated piece of plastic, an old, outdated employee identification badge from a time before the Meridian Tower had modernized its security systems. The badge was heavily scratched and faded, but the photograph of the young man printed on it remained clear enough to recognize. Maxwell leaned forward, acting entirely on pure instinct, and gently caught the edge of the plastic card before Abigail could hide it away in her pocket. He brought the faded badge close to his eyes, And the moment his gaze registered the name printed beneath the photograph, the powerful billionaire looked as though he had been struck by lightning. Every ounce of blood drained from his face, his hands began to shake uncontrollably, and his lips parted in a silent gasp of utter disbelief. The photograph showed a young, vibrant man smiling warmly at the camera, wearing the simple gray uniform that the maintenance crews used 20 years ago. Beneath the faded image, the name was printed in bold black letters: Raymond Carter. "Where did you get this?" Maxwell's voice came out as a rough, broken whisper that barely carried across the short distance between them. "Where on earth did you find this specific badge?" Abigail looked at him, confused by the sudden, terrifying vulnerability of her employer, and reached out to reclaim the plastic card. "It belongs to me," she said with a fierce, protective tone. "It is the absolute only physical piece of him that I have left in this world. Please give it back to me immediately." "Him?" Maxwell repeated, his eyes darting frantically between the old photograph and the lined, weathered face of the woman standing before him. He refused to let go of the badge, his mind desperately trying to connect pieces of a past he had long considered buried. "Who exactly was this young man to you, Abigail?" The lobby remained completely paralyzed as the billionaire awaited her response. Abigail drew herself up to her full height, her eyes burning with an ancient fire, and delivered the words that would bring Maxwell Avery's entire corporate empire crashing down to reality. "He was the father of my only child," Abigail declared, her voice echoing with a haunting clarity through the marble hall. "He was a dedicated man who gave every ounce of his strength to your family's business until the very last day of his life. And he was the man that your company left to die in absolute poverty." The tiny child's shoe slipped from her fingers once more, hitting the marble floor with a soft thud. But this time, nobody in the entire building dared to move a single muscle to pick it up. The heavy silence that followed Abigail's declaration felt like a physical weight crushing everyone in the room. Maxwell stood paralyzed, the faded badge of Raymond Carter feeling heavier than all the gold in his bank accounts. Raymond Carter, a name he had whispered in the dark corners of his conscience for 2 decades, a ghost from a past life he thought he had successfully outrun. "Everyone, return to your designated workstations immediately," Maxwell ordered suddenly, his voice low but carrying a fractured tone that caused the employees to disperse in frantic haste. Rebecca took a step toward her brother, her voice rising in a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "Maxwell, you cannot seriously listen to the wild accusations of a common cleaning woman who—" He cut her off with a single, freezing look that caused her words to die in her throat. "Go back to your office, Rebecca," he said, refusing to look her in the eye. "We will speak about your inventory reports later." Rebecca opened her mouth to argue, but the sheer fury radiating from her brother made her turn on her heel, her designer shoes clicking angrily against the floor as she walked away. When the lobby was finally empty, leaving only the billionaire, the cleaning woman, and the tiny shoe on the floor, Maxwell slowly knelt down and picked up the leather shoe himself. He held it out to Abigail, his eyes filled with a sudden, overwhelming sorrow that she did not expect to see. "Please, come with me to the top floor," he requested softly, the word please sounding strange and clumsy on the lips of a man who only ever gave commands. "We need to speak about Raymond in private." Abigail stared at the open palm of the man who held her livelihood in his hands, wondering if this was another trap designed to silence her away from witnesses. Yet, looking at the genuine terror in his eyes, she realized that the powerful Maxwell Avery was truly broken by the mention of her late husband's name. "I will go up with you," she said, taking the shoe from his hand and placing it securely in her bag. "Not because I respect your authority, but because Raymond deserves to have his story told in the highest room of this building." The executive office on the 80th floor was a sprawling testament to wealth, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass windows that looked out over the endless skyline of Chicago. Abigail had cleaned this very office hundreds of times during the dead of night, always alone, always in the dark, knowing every scratch on the desk and every speck of dust on the shelves. Standing here now in the full brilliance of the morning sun, she felt like a stranger in a room she knew by heart. Maxwell sank heavily into his leather chair, looking incredibly small behind his massive mahogany desk as he placed the faded ID badge between them. "Tell me everything about Raymond's final years," Maxwell pleaded. "Tell me how he lived and how he died." Abigail sat opposite him. "He started at 19 in the sub-basement maintaining boilers. We met at a bus stop. When Thomas was born, Raymond took every double shift to give him a better life. He never missed a day, even when his lungs burned from coal dust. Then came the accident. An outdated pressure valve exploded because the maintenance budget was cut. Raymond was underneath. Scalding steam destroyed his spine and lungs. The company promised to take care of us, but when bills mounted and he couldn't walk again, they denied workers' compensation, claiming it was his fault for not having gear they never provided. They buried us in paperwork. We sold everything for his pain medication. He died on a rainy Sunday, his last words asking me to raise Thomas without hatred. Maxwell covered his face. "I didn't know. I was in Europe for 2 years." "That is the luxury of being a billionaire," Abigail said coldly. "You remain blind while people below bleed." Maxwell stood up abruptly, walking over to the massive glass window to look out over the city he owned, his broad shoulders shaking with silent tears. "I knew Raymond Carter," he confessed, his voice breaking completely as he turned back to face her. "Long before this tower was built, when my father only owned a single warehouse and 3 delivery trucks, Raymond and I worked side by side. We were just 2 boys loading heavy crates in the summer heat, sharing our lunches on the loading dock. One night, a terrible fire broke out in that old warehouse," Maxwell revealed, his eyes filled with the smoke of a 20-year-old memory. "I was trapped behind a collapsed wall of wooden crates, suffocating in the dark, while everyone else ran for their lives into the street. Raymond was the only one who came back into the fire for me, lifting those heavy crates with his bare hands and carrying me out on his back just before the roof caved in. Your husband saved my life, Abigail." Abigail stood up from her chair, her canvas bag gripped tightly in her hand, her expression turning into something sharp and calculated. "I know he saved your life, Maxwell Avery," she said softly, stepping closer to the billionaire, "and that is exactly why I am here. I didn't get this job by pure coincidence. I spent 3 months falsifying my references and using my maiden name just to get hired as a cleaning woman in this specific tower." Maxwell stared at her, his mind reeling from the realization that the quiet woman who had been dusting his shelves was a calculated force of vengeance. "Why did you come here?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the hum of the office ventilation. "If you hated my family so much, why spend years cleaning our floors?" "Because before Raymond died, he gave me a hidden folder," Abigail explained, her hand reaching into the deep interior pocket of her uniform. "He told me that the explosion in the sub-basement wasn't a simple mechanical failure. He had discovered that someone high up in the executive offices was intentionally falsifying the safety reports, pocketing the maintenance funds, and using the sub-basement as a financial black hole to hide stolen company money." She pulled out a small, yellowed paper file, protected by a clear plastic sleeve, and placed it firmly on the mahogany desk. "Raymond tried to submit a formal report directly to you, Maxwell, but the document never reached your desk. It was intercepted, filed away under a strict confidentiality agreement, and marked as completely invalid. And the most terrifying part is that the signature authorizing his silence was intentionally torn off the bottom of the page." Maxwell reached out and opened the folder, his eyes scanning the detailed technical notes written in Raymond's familiar, precise handwriting. The report clearly outlined how millions of dollars meant for structural safety had been diverted into private offshore accounts, leaving the workers below exposed to catastrophic danger. At the bottom of the document, the paper was violently ripped away where the executive approval stamp should have been. "Someone in this building destroyed my husband's life to protect their own theft," Abigail said, her eyes burning into Maxwell's soul. "For the last 5 years, I have possessed the keys to every single office in this tower, between the hours of 2 and 5 in the morning. I wasn't just emptying your trash cans, Mr. Avery. I was searching for the missing piece of that paper." Maxwell looked up from the file, his face completely pale, as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "The inventory discrepancies that Rebecca has been reporting for the last year," he murmured, his mind racing through the corporate structure. "She claimed the maintenance staff was stealing tools and supplies from the warehouse, but it was all a distraction to keep me from auditing the primary accounts." "Your sister is highly intelligent, sir," Abigail remarked with a bitter smile. She knew that if she created a loud scandal about a poor cleaning woman stealing a bottle of medicine, nobody would look at the missing millions in the executive ledger. She almost succeeded today, if it hadn't been for that tiny child's shoe falling out of my bag. Maxwell sank back into his chair, looking at the wealth around him with a sudden, intense loathing. "Let me fix this, Abigail," he pleaded, reaching for his personal checkbook with trembling fingers. "I will give you $1 million right now. I will buy you a beautiful home in the suburbs, pay for your son's education at any university in the country, and ensure you never have to touch a broom again. Please, let me pay my debt to Raymond." Abigail walked over to the desk, her expression filled with a cold, unyielding dignity that money could never hope to purchase. "My husband did not run into a burning building 20 years ago so that you could write his widow a tax-deductible check to buy her silence," she said, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. "Raymond never asked you for a single handout while he was dying on that mattress, because he believed his dignity was worth more than your entire fortune. I am not leaving this tower until the person who killed him faces a judge." Without another word, Abigail turned and walked out of the executive office, the heavy mahogany doors closing softly behind her. Maxwell sat alone for a long time, the silence of the room pressing against his ears like a heavy ocean. He looked at the faded ID badge of his old friend, then at the empty checkbook on his desk, realizing for the first time in his life that his billions were completely useless in the face of true honor. Maxwell later followed the bus to her neighborhood and approached the small, dilapidated house. Through the window, he saw 17-year-old Thomas, with Raymond's eyes, embracing Abigail. "I was worried, Mom." Maxwell accidentally knocked over a watering can. Thomas came out with a flashlight and recognized him. "You are Maxwell Avery, the friend my father talked about. He told me about saving you from the fire. He said he never regretted it because he believed you were a good man who had forgotten how to look down." Thomas handed Maxwell a yellowed envelope. "Before my father died, he made me promise to keep this until the truth found its way to our door. It is only for you, Max." Maxwell took the envelope with fingers that had completely lost their strength, recognizing the bold, slanted handwriting on the front. "To Max, for the day the smoke finally clears." He stepped into the warm light of the small living room at Abigail's silent invitation, sitting down at the modest wooden table while the mother and son watched him from the shadows. With a racing heart, he broke the faded wax seal and began to read the final words of the man who had given everything to save him. "Max, if you are holding this paper, it means my time on this earth has come to an end, and the structural illusion of your grand empire has finally begun to fracture. I am writing this not out of anger, old friend, but out of a deep sorrow for the man you have allowed yourself to become. The young boy I shared my lunch with on the loading docks would never have allowed his managers to treat a broken human being like a discarded piece of iron. The tragic truth, Max, is that you did not become cruel. You simply became blind. You allowed your success to lift you so high into the clouds that you forgot that the entire weight of your tower rests on the backs of men working in the dark sub-basement. When a powerful man stops looking down, he creates a vast shadow, and it is in that exact darkness that evil people choose to build their nests. The person who cut the maintenance budget and falsified the safety records is someone who shares your very blood, Max. Rebecca has been systematic in her destruction, using your blind trust as a shield to steal millions from the safety funds. Do not seek vengeance for my death, but I beg you to open your eyes and look at the darkness you have financed. Take care of my Abigail, and ensure my Thomas has the chance to study the law. Your brother from the fire, Raymond. The letter fell from Maxwell's hands onto the wooden table, his face buried in his palms as a deep, agonizing sob tore from his chest. Abigail sat down slowly across from him, her hand touching the yellowed paper with a gentle reverence that showed her anger had finally transitioned into a profound, shared grief.
"He forgave you before he even died, Maxwell,"
she said softly, her voice no longer carrying the icy distance of the tower. He spent his final days worrying about your soul more than his own broken body. Abigail stood up and walked to a loose floorboard near the kitchen counter, lifting the wood to reveal a second, much thicker folder, filled with hundreds of pages of meticulous handwritten notes. For 5 years, while I was sweeping your offices, I was documenting every single midnight meeting Rebecca held with foreign developers, she said, placing the massive accumulation of evidence on the table. I have bank routing numbers, dates, and times when the maintenance funds were diverted into dummy corporations. We can end this tonight, Maxwell stated, his tears drying as a sudden, hard resolve took over his features. I will grant you full administrative access to our secure digital archives in the sub-basement. If we combine your physical logs with the deleted financial records stored on the legacy mainframe, we will have enough evidence to ensure Rebecca spends the rest of her life behind bars. 3 hours later, under the cover of the midnight darkness, the billionaire and the cleaning woman entered the silent, imposing structure of the Meridian Tower once again. They descended deep into the cold concrete labyrinth of the sub-basement, where the massive, outdated steam boilers stood like silent iron sentinels in the shadows. Maxwell unlocked the heavy steel door of the legacy archive room, his fingers flying across the computer keyboard to recover the encrypted files that his sister thought she had permanently erased. For hours, they worked side by side in the flickering green light of the computer terminal, the wealthy executive and the woman who cleaned his floors, their social status completely erased by their shared pursuit of justice. Page after page of fraudulent transactions began to appear on the screen, matching perfectly with the handwritten dates in Abigail's logbook. They had finally captured the definitive proof of Rebecca's systemic corporate crimes. However, their triumph was cut short by the sudden, harsh glare of flashlights illuminating the dark concrete corridor outside the archive room. 2 uniformed police officers stepped through the doorway, accompanied by a cold, smiling Rebecca Avery, who held a freshly signed warrant in her manicured hand. "Officer Donald," Rebecca said to the older policeman beside her, pointing a sharp finger at Abigail. "There is the woman I reported. She has unlawfully entered our secure facility to steal proprietary corporate data." Abigail felt the cold steel of the handcuffs snapping around her wrists before Maxwell could even step between them. "This is an absolute outrage, Rebecca," Maxwell roared, his voice bouncing off the concrete walls. "We have the proof of your fraud right here on this screen. Release this woman immediately." Rebecca merely laughed, a sound that echoed with a chilling clinical detachment through the dark sub-basement. "You are too late, brother," she whispered. "I have already taken care of everything." Inside the sterile, brightly lit room of the local police precinct, Abigail sat with her head held high, refusing to let the gray concrete walls diminish the quiet dignity that defined her character. Officer Donald, the veteran policeman who had processed her arrest, sat across from her with a deeply troubled expression on his face, looking through the stack of corporate documents Rebecca had provided. "This situation smells of a corporate setup, Ms. Vance," the old officer remarked quietly, out of earshot of his superiors. "But until the chief reviews the formal statements, my hands are completely tied by the warrant." The heavy wooden door of the interrogation room flew open, and Maxwell stormed inside, his expensive wool coat disheveled, followed closely by Rebecca and a team of high-priced corporate attorneys. "Clear the room, officer," Maxwell commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of his billions. "I need to speak with my sister and this woman immediately." Officer Donald looked at Abigail, nodded slowly, and stepped out into the corridor, closing the heavy door behind him. Maxwell turned to his sister, his eyes burning with an intense, unadulterated fury. "The game is completely over, Rebecca," he hissed, slamming a copy of the recovered financial records onto the metal table. "I have already sent copies of these files to the federal prosecutors. You can manufacture all the false theft charges you want against Abigail, but these bank routing numbers carry your personal signature. You are going to prison." Rebecca did not flinch. Instead, she slowly extracted a single, heavily guarded piece of paper from her leather portfolio and slid it across the cold metal table toward her brother. "I am well aware that my signature is on those financial accounts, Maxwell," she said, her voice dropping into a venomous, triumphant whisper. "But before you deliver your grand speech to the federal prosecutors, I suggest you take an exceptionally close look at the original cancellation order that buried Raymond Carter's safety report 20 years ago." Maxwell picked up the document, his eyes instantly tracking to the bottom of the page where the missing signature should have been. In this original, unredacted copy, the paper was perfectly intact, and next to Rebecca's elegant script was a second, unmistakable signature that caused the billionaire's heart to stop completely. It was his own signature, stamped in thick black ink, authorizing the immediate termination of Raymond's medical benefits and the total suppression of the safety investigation. "You signed it the very morning you returned from your European tour, brother," Rebecca whispered maliciously, leaning across the table until her cold eyes were inches from his. "You were so exhausted, so completely desperate to clear the stack of paperwork on your desk, that you didn't read a single line. If I go down for corporate fraud and manslaughter, the entire world will see that the great Maxwell Avery personally signed the order that left his lifesaver to die in a gutter. If I fall, you fall directly beside me." Maxwell stared at his own signature, the room spinning around him as the sheer magnitude of his past negligence crashed down upon his soul. He looked at Abigail, whose face had turned into a mask of pure, heartbreaking betrayal as she stared at the document between them. A smaller man would have destroyed the evidence, negotiated a private settlement, and sacrificed the cleaning woman to save his own global reputation. But Maxwell looked at the memory of the fire, looked at the tiny child's shoe in his mind, and made the hardest choice of his life. "You are entirely correct, Rebecca," Maxwell said, his voice suddenly becoming remarkably calm and steady as he turned to face the window. "I did sign that paper without reading it. My criminal negligence and my absolute blindness allowed you to destroy a good man's life. I am just as responsible for Raymond's death as you are, and I will stand beside you in front of the judge to accept my full prison sentence. Officer Donald," he shouted toward the door, "bring the arrest logs. I am presenting a full confession of my own corporate negligence." The sudden, complete collapse of Rebecca's leverage left her standing paralyzed in the center of the interrogation room, her mouth opening and closing silently as her attorneys scrambled to gather their papers. She had spent her entire life operating under the absolute certainty that a billionaire would always choose to protect his money and his name above all else. She had never once conceived of a wealth that could willingly choose to destroy itself for the sake of an old friend's memory. Within an hour, the false charges against Abigail were officially dropped, and Maxwell was released on his own recognizance, pending a formal federal investigation into the company's historical safety records. The midnight air was freezing as Maxwell and Abigail stepped out onto the concrete steps of the precinct, the quiet space between them no longer filled with the tension of class division, but with the heavy solemnity of two people who had survived a long war. Their quiet reflection was shattered by the sound of a roaring engine as a battered pickup truck pulled up to the curb, and Mrs. Beatrice, a kind, elderly neighbor from Abigail's street, leaned out of the window with a face pale with absolute terror. "Abigail, thank God you are out," the old woman cried, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. "It's Thomas. He saw the police taking you away from the house, and he went completely wild with anger. He grabbed his father's old work tools and ran toward the Meridian Tower, saying he was going to force the truth out of your sister himself." Abigail felt the air leave her lungs as she pulled a crumpled piece of notebook paper from Mrs. Beatrice's hand, recognizing her son's frantic handwriting. "Mom, I cannot sit in this empty house while they lock you up for crimes you didn't commit. Dad's pair of shoes is on the shelf, and I am wearing his courage tonight. I am going to the deep sub-basement where they hurt him. I will make them tell the truth. I love you." "The sub-basement," Maxwell said, his face darkening with a sudden, terrifying realization as he sprinted toward his car. "Rebecca's personal security team is still clearing out the physical files from the lower levels before the federal agents arrive tomorrow morning. If Thomas disrupts them down there in the dark, they will treat him like a hostile intruder. We have to get there before my sister's men find him." The luxury sedan tore through the deserted streets of Chicago like a silver bullet, Abigail pressing her forehead against the glass window as she prayed to a husband who could no longer hear her. The towering silhouette of the Meridian Tower loomed in the distance, no longer a symbol of architectural achievement, but a terrifying glass fortress, holding her only child captive in its concrete bowels. They arrived at the service entrance in a cloud of burning rubber, Maxwell using his executive master key to bypass the main security gates and running directly toward the service elevators that descended into the lower depths of the earth. The elevator doors opened into the cold, damp concrete corridors of the sub-basement, where the heavy, industrial thrum of the building's infrastructure sounded like the heartbeat of a hidden monster. They sprinted through the dark hallways, guided only by the emergency lights, until they heard the echoing sound of a youthful shout, followed by the heavy, metallic crash of an iron pipe hitting the concrete floor. "Get away from those filing cabinets!" Thomas's voice echoed from the main boiler room, filled with a desperate, terrifying bravery. "Those papers belong to my father. You aren't destroying anything else." They burst through the heavy iron doors of the central boiler room to find a scene illuminated by the harsh, flickering glare of industrial work lights. Thomas was backed against the massive rusted hull of the primary steam boiler, his knuckles bleeding, holding a heavy iron wrench in his trembling hands as three burly private security guards slowly closed in on him. Rebecca stood a few yards away, behind the safety line, her face twisted into a mask of desperate, hysterical rage as she pointed a small, silver handgun directly at the boy's chest. "Give me that backpack right now, you little street rat," Rebecca screamed. "Your father ruined my standing 20 years ago, and I won't let his offspring take my fortune. Drop the wrench, or I will end this family line tonight." "Rebecca, drop the weapon immediately," Maxwell shouted, stepping between her gun and the boy. "Police are coming. There is nothing left for you to save." Abigail rushed to Thomas and hugged him. "I have you, my boy. Drop the wrench. The truth has won." Rebecca's gun hand shook. She whispered she hated Maxwell because their father never looked at her. She wanted something of her own. The gun slipped from her fingers. Police took her away. Maxwell told her she had dug a deep grave. The passage of time has a quiet, beautiful way of smoothing over the sharpest edges of human suffering, turning the deep craters of our grief into fertile ground, where new life can finally take root. In the weeks that followed that terrible night in the dark sub-basement, the great Meridian Tower underwent a transformation so profound that the citizens of Chicago began to look at the glass structure with an entirely new sense of reverence. Maxwell Avery did not run away from his past negligence. Instead, he stood before the federal courts, accepted his legal fines, and dedicated every single dollar of his immense personal fortune to rewriting the legacy of his family's name. The dark, neglected archive room in the lower depths of the building was permanently closed, and in its place, right in the center of the grand marble lobby, where Abigail had once been publicly humiliated, a beautiful, sunlit community center was established. A simple bronze plaque was mounted on the pristine white wall, featuring the engraved image of a young, smiling mechanic, and a single line of text: "The Raymond Carter Foundation, dedicated to the unseen hands that build our world." Abigail Vance never stopped taking the early morning public transit bus, refusing to allow her new position as the director of the charitable foundation to alter the simple, grounded dignity that had carried her through her darkest years. She understood with the deep, quiet wisdom that only comes from a lifetime of labor that the moment a leader stops riding the bus with the common people is the exact moment they begin to lose their sight. Every morning, she sits among the tired faces of the working class, her canvas bag resting comfortably on her lap, no longer a shield against humiliation, but a vessel carrying hope for the thousands of families her foundation now protects. And Thomas, the young boy who had once run into the dark with nothing but his father's worn shoe for courage, now walks the pristine halls of the Northwestern University School of Law with his head held high. He studies the complex mechanisms of civil rights and labor law, his young heart driven by a beautiful, unyielding promise to become the voice for the thousands of workers who remain trapped in the silent shadows of corporate greed. On the wooden desk in his small dormitory room, sitting directly next to his heavy legal textbooks, rests the pair of tiny, scuffed child's shoes, their soles now professionally repaired, but their worn leather surfaces left untouched to serve as a permanent compass for his journey through life. When we reach the autumn of our lives, we realize that the true measure of existence is not the height of the towers we build, but our willingness to look down at the ground we walk upon. We live in a loud, distracted world that teaches us to chase glittering illusions of wealth while trampling the quiet beauty of souls who keep our world turning. We build palaces of glass and steel, forgetting that our success depends on the hidden strength of people in the dark foundations below. True wealth is found in the unyielding dignity of a mother who goes without so her child can study, and in the quiet honor of a worker who risks his life for a friend without asking reward. No human being is ever truly invisible. Every soul carries a story worthy of respect and protection. If we become so high and mighty that we can no longer see the small broken shoes of the poor on our marble floors, we have lost the only wealth that matters. In the final accounting, the truth finds its way home, and the smallest acts of quiet love endure.